Welcome, everyone. I am Kimberly Griffin. I am the publisher and co-founder of the Mississippi Free Press. And I'm solo tonight because my co-founder, Donna Ladd, editor Donna Ladd, is not feeling great. So I am alone in the pilot seat and so happy to welcome someone I have known longer than I may have been alive. No, that's not true. uh, Carlton Turner, who is the co-director and co-founder of Sipp Culture here in Utica, Mississippi. So excited to have you here tonight, Carlton. When someone mentioned we should have Carlton on the show, you know how your people, you forget how wonderful they are. I was like, oh yeah, we should. It doesn't make. I should have thought of that myself. We're so glad to have you here, and I'm just going to jump in.
All right.
One of the first questions I always like to ask people is how they got where they are, because I think our young people believe what they can see. So when you explain those steps, even if they're haphazard, like one of the things I always tell young people is, I don't really care what you majored in college. I will hire you for other. I don't care. I don't. And they're like, you don't? I was like, not that much. But tell us. I know your story. But I'd love to hear your story about growing up in Utica and what that was like for you, and how you moved from artist to artist, co-founder, funder, creator of community.
Oh, wow. So happy to be here. Sending love to Donna, and thank you, Kimberly, for the invitation and for this conversation. So I am the son of Genevia Turner and Emmett Turner. Emmett, who's from Harlem, and really taught us a lot about the Harlem Renaissance culture of jazz and just the music that he was bringing, and just his kind of like metropolitan, cosmopolitan life in New York, blended with my mother, who is from Utica, Mississippi. My family's been in this community for 8 generations. My mother had left and moved to New York, and kind of pursuing a life outside the South. And met my father, got married. They moved back to Mississippi, where my mother was from. And I was raised by my mother and father, and also my grandparents, F.C. Roberts and Samuel Roberts. So with my father being from Harlem, we got a lot of that city life lessons and just kind of upbringing, but we were steeped in the South. We were Mississippi all day long. The blues, the gospel, just coming up in that age of hip hop as well. All those cultures influenced the way that we kind of like understood our place in the world. Went to college at the University of Mississippi, where I feel like I received kind of like a PhD in understanding what institutional racism looks like in practice. And it was there where my brother and I, Maurice Turner, founded the group Mugabe, Men Under Guidance Acting Before Early Extinction. We left college early, didn't graduate, and pursued a life of music, and ended up, kind of honing our chops in Jackson, Mississippi, at places like Southern Vibes with Jonathan Anderson and C.D. McGinnis and David Bryan Williams and Michael McClendon and Derek Johnson and just a host of folks, Ramona Ward, so many people that influenced our work, and Ezra Brown and 7 All Art Studios. Just learning and playing and engaging in the scene of arts and culture. At the same time, kind of like beginning to develop that sensibility with learning from, civil rights veterans and kind of growing up in that time as a young artist around folks like Bob Moses and John O'Neill and folks like C.C. Bryan and so many other people, Curtis Muhammad and Hollis Watkins, people that had an influence on helping us understand how to use our art and culture as a practice for liberation. And, I'm trying to give you the Cliff Notes version, but at some point we ran into the organization.
Don't give us the Cliff Notes version. Give us, we have an hour.
We
Go.
have an hour. At some point in our work, we met an organization called Alternate Roots. We were introduced to Alternate Roots by Carolyn Morris, who at that point was working for the Mississippi Arts Commission, and was doing a lot of partnering with Alternate Roots. For those that don't know Alternate Roots is an organization that was founded at the Highlander Research and Education Center in 1976 by artists who were looking at ways to really just create more agency and voice for themselves in this new world. And so we met this organization, and they taught us how to effectively engage in our artistic practice, make a living at it, but also make a difference at it. And that was a different pathway to a career in the arts than the one that we understood was basically the only one that we knew, which was, you got to be a star, you got to make the money, you got to have the big gigs, and you got to, grind out in this gig economy. And Alternate Roots was saying, nah, there's another way that you can go about this that can bring you both the joy and kind of like the deep appreciation of the craft, and you can impact the communities that you're a part of and the communities that you are most interested in engaging with. With that organization, to say it changed my life is really an understatement. It influences everything that I do and has influenced everything that I've done for the last 20 years. I met some of the most influential people in that space, people that are still part of my world, part of my creative team, part of my collaborative practice, and people who are still teaching me, people that I'm learning from, and a community that I continue to pour into. I was with that organization as a staff member starting in 2004 and remained on staff until 2018. I spent 9 years as the executive director, during which time one of my most famous accomplishments was to poach Wendy Shenefeld and get her to work for Roots. I've been knowing Wendy for a very long time, and her time working at the Mississippi Arts Commission as well. She used to be our kind of like contact at the agency as we were doing work in the Whole Schools Initiative and through the all of the artistic projects with the schools. And got her to come work for Alternate Roots, and she's still there even after I left. She's still doing it, and I think she found a home that she can continue to grow with for a long time. I think my time at Roots really shaped me because it introduced me to a national community of artists who were also engaging in a lot of the same practices that I was interested in Mississippi. We were rooted in Mississippi. I've never lived anywhere other than Mississippi. But this work and the organization, Alternate Roots, took us all around the country. So we got a chance to be in community with so many wonderful people all across the country, learning from different approaches, different communities, learning with different artists, collaborating with different artists. And it really just made a beautiful difference in the way that we saw our work and what we thought was possible as we began to shift our work from out here working, as I think one of the first questions you asked me tonight before we got on was like, are you in Utica? Or are you on the road? Like, my life has been on the road for like the last 20 years. It wasn't until the pandemic and when I really was able to really slow down and be here more full time. But it was in 2017, when my wife and I founded the Mississippi Center for Cultural Production, kind of in this transition moment away from Roots and into developing a space here in Utica that represented all the things that I was learning, all the things that I desired as an artist to have as I was, coming up as a young person. I wanted to make sure I could create, and that my wife and I could create together to make sure that we were creating an institution that could support artists like ourselves, for them to have a space in a rural community that could offer them the support, the nurturing, the surrounding, the funding, whatever they need to uplift the stories of the people that I feel like are responsible for my learning and my growth and development and for the person that I am.
So tell us, I know a little bit about Sipp culture. I don't know as much as I probably should because the pandemic thwarted my attempts to learn more and uh, to visit for the first time. I still haven't been out there. One of the things that propelled you to start Sipp culture, if I'm remembering correctly, is the loss of the community's only grocery store. Or tell me, tell me part of that story. I may be mixing up part of the story,
Yeah,
but because one of
no,
the
that's
things that
that's
I
important.
think, yeah, as we talk about food deserts, it's interesting the conversation between food deserts and cultural deserts and news deserts and cultural deserts. Like they kind of are interwoven and connect to one another. Because if you look at those maps, you'll see the loss is just more than one loss. There's the loss of a grocery store, the loss of the last doctor, the loss of the last newspaper, the loss of the library. It's just the loss continues.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I think what's prompted the development of sip culture was one, like I said, it was a situation of looking around the landscape and recognizing that the places that I needed as an artist didn't exist. Like the support structures that I had been privy to, the places like thinking about all my time at Alternate Roots and being in so many different communities with artists, seeing the types of cultural approaches and interventions that artists were leading in their own community to try to provide a space for the development and upholding and uplifting of culture. And so that was the first impetus for the development of sip culture. I think the grocery store became a hallmark moment in our community's trajectory because it really marked like the last semblance of like necessity that had left the community. It was so connected to our identity that when it left, people felt like they were no longer a town. And so we didn't start because of the loss of the grocery store, but we used that moment of the community thinking about what it means to have a grocery store and needing to get a grocery store back as an opportunity to engage the community in a conversation around food and culture that leads us to a place of understanding what agency means. And so our community, that was, the grocery store, that thing was, when it left in 2014, it was also the same year that they closed the last high school in Utica. So Hines County Agricultural High School closed also in 2014. And that may be another Utica. That's definitely not our Utica, but it's all good. There was a sunflower in our community that left in 2014, but it's these opportunities for us to engage the community in a different kind of conversation about agency, about purpose. And so we started Sip Culture with a conversation with the community. And that conversation went something like this. We put a map on the wall of the Tri-County areas, which included Utica, Claiborne County, and Warren County. And we asked the community members that came to plot their lives in 4 points. And the 4 points were: where do you live? Where do you work? Where do you worship? And where do you shop? And so as the community began to plot those 4 things, what we saw was that Utica was here. And most people said they live here, but they worked out there and they shopped over here and they went to church over at this big church outside of their community. And what we realized together with the community is that our community, which was founded as a center of cultural production, had now become a bedroom community. And so we asked the community, like, are you content with this identity? First, did you even recognize yourself as a bedroom community? And most people didn't. They were still critiquing a community that had already gone by the wayside at least a decade before. But their only frame of reference was what it was. And so we couldn't get past critiquing what it was to understand what it needs to be. And so that's where Sip culture came into the conversation. We wanted to engage the community in a call and response to deepen our understanding of what the community needs and how we can then kind of like reorient our imaginations to begin to think about retrofitting our community for the 21st century, not just trying to remake what had been in the 20th century. And so that became the primary basis of our work here, our hyper-local work in the town of Utica.
So when you say that people were critiquing, and I think I'm using your words right, critiquing what it had been, is that, say more about that?
Yeah,
Because
so
I think we are doing this in almost every aspect of our lives and community.
yeah. So when people would get together to talk about what was happening in the community and what needed to happen, everything was, we need that like we had it back then. We need to have this because we used to have that and we need it back again. And so the community that they were wanting to build was just a nostalgic, it was born out of nostalgia. And it was basically recreating the community as it had been. So the way that this worked with the grocery store was the community would respond to the question, what do you need? The community would say, we need a grocery store. And so we would say, okay, well, maybe we need to reframe the question. The issue is about groceries. It's not about the grocery store. So let's reframe the question as, how do we get groceries? See, when they closed the grocery store in 2014, not one person in Utica starved to death. Not one person. So they still found food. People found food. They traveled 25 miles to Crystal Springs, or 20 miles to Raymond, or 25 miles to Vicksburg, or Port Gibson, or wherever they would go, or wherever they worked, they would find food, and they would still find a way to survive. So it wasn't about that. It was about understanding that if we only think in terms of what we had, so if we only think about the grocery store, then our solution, we think it's already there, that we need a grocery store, and we don't really understand the fullness of why the grocery store is no longer there in the first place. So this is where the role of story comes into play. We use story as a way to unpack the basic necessities of our community development, which is how people arrive. What are the transitions? What do you remember? Not in terms of working from a place of nostalgia. We're not trying to recreate the past. We're using the past as a place of information gathering so that we can prepare to work towards the future. And that's a very different type of process than the process that we're used to, which is responding to trauma. And the trauma response that we were giving during this time is that we need a grocery store back because the trauma was that our grocery store had been taken. Right. And so our response is that we need that grocery store back, and it's a trauma-informed response. What we ask the community to do is, tell me about growing up in Utica. Whatever that growing up means for you, whether you grew up in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, whether you just arrived here 10 years ago. Tell us about that story. What was it like when you got here? What was your relationship with food? What was your relationship with community? Who grew what? Who did what? Tell us about the makeup. So we began to develop and craft a story that includes multiple perspectives about what the community was. Now, this isn't a framework for us to say, okay, we need to recreate those things. We need to create those things. It's an opportunity for us to identify what has already been achieved so that we know all of the viable options that we have to choose from to move into our future. So, for instance, when I grew up in this community, about 70 to 80% of the food that people ate that I was around, in the community parts of the community that I was around, came from the local ground. It came from either your garden or your neighbor's garden or their livestock. It came from something in our community. So everyone was implicated in both the production of food, the distribution of food, the preparation of food. That was a community effort. So, okay, so we know that could work because that's already been done before. So we put that on the board. Now that's a possibility. So we know that we had a butcher shop in the community. Okay, well, that's a possibility. Well, we know we had grocery stores, we had this kind of store, we had this kind of store. All those are possibilities. So once you get all the possibilities up there, then now we can talk about what fits our current resources and assets and gaps and needs. It's a very different conversation than just identifying straight off the bat that the need is a grocery store. The grocery store in and of itself is an extractive element, because we're not talking about a community-owned grocery store. We're talking about enticing some sort of franchise.
So, Carlton, what is an extractive element?
Yeah. So basically, the question becomes, where does the money follow the money? So where's the money going? So in a grocery store, let's say Sunflower, which no longer exists, Sunflower, County Market, Country Market, whatever the little country store is now, it comes to town. Well, they have shareholders that don't live in Utica. They have, their whole infrastructure is based outside of our community. Their banking is done outside the community. They're procuring their food and their goods outside of our community. Their management will likely come from outside the community. So when you go and spend $1 in that store, 95 cents out of that dollar is probably going outside of the community. So it's not a resource that is giving back to the community, everything that is, and you have to literally build a building to get that resource in. So the community goes into debt first before the grocery store even will agree to open. And then the grocery store holds you hostage to say, well, if the profit margin isn't X, Y, and Z, then we're going to have to close that store and move to another location, because they're driven by profit margin. So it's an extractive industry. It doesn't give back to the community. It provides a service, but the question becomes, what does the community end up paying for that service? So we have to put all of those things on the board. If not, we're not having a real conversation about the possibility, and we're as a community putting ourselves back into the same traps and binds that we're literally just seeing how that impacts us. Because 40 years ago, again, my grandmother was only buying flour and sugar from the grocery store, not even meal. Like, they were making their own meal. Like all these things they were creating for themselves. So there was a cottage industry that drove economic development, that drove food. And that's also deeply tied and connected to community health and wellness. So right now, the only grocery store we have in our community is the dollar store. You go in the dollar store and you do an inventory of what's on the shelves. They have a whole aisle for potato chips. They have a whole aisle for soft drinks. They have a whole aisle for cereal and frozen food section. And the produce area is about 8 feet wide. And that produce is things that our community doesn't even really eat. Brussels sprouts and some kale. Like, that ain't, Utica folks in Utica can't eat that stuff. So it's like, when you think about the design of it, there's better ways for us to work. We are a community that was built on agricultural production. The Utica Normal Industrial Institute, which became Utica Junior College, which became Hines Community College Utica campus, was started by William Holtzclaw in 1903 as an extension of the Tuskegee Institute. It used the practices of W.E.B. Du Bois and George Washington Carver, bringing Black cultural production as a means of community development and economic sustainability to Black communities. So that's our history. That's who we were. That's who we have been. And even before that, you have a community that is 30 minutes from the Mississippi River. So in the cotton heyday, it was participating in that. It had a railroad down the center of town. So it was shipping goods back and forth. It had 3 cotton gins, 2 sawmills. It was a community that was based on production. And so what we're asking the community to do is engage in a broader, more nuanced conversation about what it means to be engaged in, to re-identify ourselves as a town of production versus a town of just consumers. And that's the real work.
It's so interesting because my family is from, you probably have never heard of this town, Pachuta, Mississippi.
Pachuta.
And so, yeah, it's not Shibuda. It's next door to Shibuda. And Shibuda is bigger. And I think Eddie Ruffin was from Shibuda. And it's a village. That's what it says on your tax when you pay your taxes. You're paying taxes to the village of Pachuta. And so that's in Clark County. And I spent more than half of my childhood at my grandparents' house there. And my grandparents, I was a young grandchild. They had grandchildren in college because I was the daughter. So they were past farming. I mean, like what, but they still produced a lot of food because it's hard once you start producing food, even if you're taking away something every year, you're still producing quite a bit of food. And so they would send food home with their children, frozen in a cooler, whatever. And I think I was 15 before I had jelly. No, I may have been 18 before I had jelly out of a store. And I was like, what is this garbage? And I know I was 15 before I had a green vegetable that someone in my family had not produced. And my grandparents, like I said, they weren't farming hard. They were just doing what they had been doing and had sold off, cows and things like that. But and I was probably about 15 before I had an egg, unless it was an emergency. So there may have been some emergency eggs from an egg, eggs were in our home that were not from my grandparents or someone like that or someone close to my grandparents. Oh yeah, that's Pachuta. Oh, that's the library. It is still open and operational by the big truck. And that's if you go back to the store, keep going. Okay, so the store right there, the white building, that is the store. That is a store of many a treat from my childhood. So much good candy was bought in that store. And the mayor owned that store, I believe. But it's interesting because I'll say that to people and they'll be like, what? Because you're younger than me by a little bit, by probably 5 years. But that idea of that life seems so far away for so many people, of that community life, of that, we found out my grandfather's barn was burning because the nosiest lady in town would sit in the window. And she called my grandmother and said, Tina, the shed's burning, because she would just sit in the window. But it was good because that's how we put the fire out. And so it's interesting to hear people, because that loss for some of our young people, I think, feels very far away. But for me and you, it's very close and tangible. And the fact that you are bringing us back, what I believe, so quickly, even if it's not probably as fast as you want it to be, but the fact that you recognize the loss and brought it back so quickly. Tell me some of the things that you guys are doing day to day. We talked about, you're working with bringing food back into the community. What are some other things that artists are returning to the community? Because we all know that art and food and culture, all those things are tied together. And so many times folks try to, now I'm gonna get on soapbox. What's the word I'm looking for? Folks sanitize our culture and make it flashy and fancy, our culture from our porch. But talk a little bit about some of the other stuff that's going on. And maybe anything we need to. We talked about this a little bit, but anything else you want us to know?
Yeah, I want to start with a quick story that's connected to what you just said about jelly. So we've been doing a 3-year research project with an organization called Imagining America, based out of University of California, Davis. And the basis of the research is looking at the role and impact of storytelling on a community's ability to make decisions about their food infrastructure. And so we were doing a focus group with some seniors, and one of the women said, she talked about all the production, that they used to, the family used to produce this and used to produce that, and she said, she said two things. She said nobody wanted to grow up and be a farmer. We were already farmers. People wanted to grow up and they had aspirations for something different.
Right. Oh my gosh.
She also said that she remembers going to the store for the first time, and this is an elder. This is a sister. She's probably in her 70s. She said, "I remember going to the store for the first time and getting jelly off the shelf, and what I realized in that moment was, oh, we ain't got to make that jelly no more." What that said to me was like, okay, so one, there's a lot of trauma around our relationship to the land. And so our younger generations, like, my generation and those younger than me, don't necessarily see the land as a place of power. They see the land as a place of shame and degradation. It's connected to enslavement. It's connected to Jim Crow. It's connected to those not educated enough to get out of the fields or go to institutions to be educated. So it's connected to all of these places of trauma. So we have to deal with that. And if we think that we just gonna get people to move back to farming without dealing with the trauma, it's not gonna work. Young folks ain't having it. Folks my age ain't having it. They're not trying to hear it. So we have to reestablish land with power, like, soil with sustenance and health and wellness. So I wanted to just share that with you because I think your story about the jelly was really, I heard it so many times and people saying what had happened in that moment in which they realized that they didn't have to work the way that they had been working to eat. Like eating then became this luxury, versus a chore. And so we had to deal with that. Go ahead. You want to respond? Go ahead.
Oh, well, yeah, because it's interesting because, I never thought about it being traumatizing. Like, that's interesting. I think my aunts and uncles, what they wanted, their aspiration was not to go up north, but to go to every flashy southern city they had heard about. They wanted to go move to New Orleans or move to Memphis or move to Birmingham and live that life and still be around their people. But nobody wanted to be a farmer. My grandfather didn't want anybody to be a farmer. That's not why he was working so hard. He wanted people to leave and go somewhere where they could control their own destiny in their own way. And so, but yeah, I got to think about that trauma. But answer the question I actually asked you before we started veering off into that.
Yes. So some of the things that we're doing. So I just spoke about the research project. So we've been doing an participatory action research project with the community, including surveys and focus groups and oral histories, looking at this, how storytelling can help to empower the work that we're doing around our food system. We have our artistic programs, and I'll come back to the agricultural program, but let me start with the ag programs, because we have a small community farm on 17 acres of green space here in town. We have about an acre and a half in production. We have a greenhouse, 1,800 square foot greenhouse that we're in the process of completing. And we run a small farm apprentice program in which we teach young people and not so young people what it means to do regenerative farming, no-till, all organic farming. So that's a tradition that we really lost touch with. So we do that training in an 18-month program where we basically pay full-time salaries over the course of 18 months to train and with health benefits and the whole nine, starting with a livable wage of $15 an hour. So we currently have 4 people in the program, and that program just started its new iteration. So the artistic programs, we work with artists through our Rural Performance Production Lab, which is also a year-long program in which we work with artists in a 5-state region. We serve artists in Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Alabama, providing them with direct funding. We give out from $2,500 to $15,000 per artist. We support them with residency space in our space in Utica. So we have a residency house, which is our office as well. We have room to sleep up to 6 artists at a time. They stay here for, anywhere from a weekend up to a month. Most of these artists stay for 3 weeks. We provide them with advisors and consultants to help develop and move their work along. It's project based, but it's not about producing the. It doesn't start and end with an idea and end with the production or final product. It starts with moving through a process with an artist based on wherever they are and wherever they're trying to go. So that program is in its second year, and we will be launching new rounds. Those are our advisors there, Clyde Valentine, who's at Ignite Arts Dallas there in SMU, Millicent Johnny, who's a world-class choreographer based out of where's FAMU? Tallahassee. Nick Sly, who's with Mondo Bizarro, he's based out of New Orleans, Louisiana, and Stephanie McKee-Anderson, who is the executive director of Junebug Productions, which is based in New Orleans, but Junebug Productions was formerly the Free Southern Theater, which was founded in Jackson at Tougaloo College by John O'Neill, Doris Derby, who we just lost, and they just laid to rest this week in Atlanta, and Gilbert Moses. And they were part of the Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer, they were founded during that time. Anyway, that's one of our most important programs because it supports artists. It provides many different ways of supporting artists. We also have an artist relief fund. During the pandemic, we worked with our collaborators through the Intercultural Leadership Institute. You can pop up We Are ELI, WeAreILI.org. And that particular program, we work to develop a leadership institute for artists of color to learn how to work across cultural barriers without losing themselves. So many times we work and try to develop leadership based on models that don't actually reflect our communities. And so ELI was designed to be a model that actually takes from the leadership that we have in our communities and use that as the model for what we think leadership should look like. So leadership doesn't end up looking like corporate America or looking like corporate institutions. It ends up looking like grandma and auntie and Uncle Sonny, and the work that happens in community and intimate spaces by people who love you and care for you and think about your entire being when they think about supporting you. And so We Are ELI is a project that we started together when I was at Alternate Roots, and Sipp Culture continues to be a partner in that. And through that, we have like a series of 30 fellows that come through each year. And it's with my partners, the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, the Pa'i Foundation in Hawaii, First Peoples Fund, which is the largest indigenous peoples organization for supporting culture bearers, and Alternate Roots. And so that's one of the programs that we do, but together we leveraged about $6 million to support artists across our various areas during the pandemic. And we also just launched a new round of ELI Fellows. In addition to that, we are in the development of another fund that we're tentatively naming the Southern Futures Fund, in which we will be just supporting artists that are doing work in the 5-state region that aren't residency based, but just about providing more funding and resources for Southern artists, which we know don't get a big share of the national philanthropic support for artists.
So are you a Southern family if you don't have an Uncle Sonny? My dad's Uncle Sonny. He's Sonny. He's Uncle Sonny, and his brother, was Uncle Brother.
Uncle Brother.
Uncle Brother.
I had an Uncle Brother too. He was Uncle Sammy, but everybody called him Brother.
I was Uncle William and Uncle Sylvester, but they are Uncle Sonny and Uncle Brother. Yeah, it's interesting because what I hear you saying without saying is evaluation of the work, which often doesn't happen with Southern artists, even though our work is derivatized and people become famous. Creating some derivative of our work of people, fashion designers become famous, creating some derivative of our look, of our quilt making. What if you are talking to an artist that maybe can't quite get to you just now? What are things you want them to know about how they can move in this world where there is a colonization, no mindset? um, retain who they are, grow their work, and I think that's the end of my question. What
Yeah.
are some things you tell artists?
So for me, and this is one of the big lessons again from growing up in Jackson with folks like Bob Moses and Hollis Watkins and Naya Watkins and Celie McGinnis and all the folks that I've been naming, is that you have to know who your community is. See, art making without accountability is just ego. Like if you're making art and you don't have a community to hold you accountable, you kind of stroking your ego. And some people dig that, and that's fine. That's just never been the art that has ever turned me on or got me interested. And so I tend to offer that kind of advice to artists. One, identify your community. Who are the people that can hold you accountable? Who are the people that can give you advice? And it hurts, but you know that it was given in love. You know, who are the people that hold you when nobody else holds you? And I think that is number one. So that's the first issue of advice. Is like identify your accountability team. Two, as an artist, if you're going to do work that is deeply connected in community, you have to develop a deep sense of listening. Listening is the deepest skill that you can have, and it will. And those that listen and can really comprehend the community that they're around, that they're part of, will be able to produce art that can't be duplicated, because that art stems from real people and real activity as a human being. I mean, to me, that's the work that we do as culture bearers, as artists, is to advance culture, is to both make sure that our culture, and for me, this is about the culture of my grandparents, the culture of my parents. That culture raised me, and it's not perfect, it's not infallible, it's not flawless, but there are pieces of that culture that are essential to my identity, and they're essential to me becoming the person that I am. And there's pieces of that culture that I need to make sure are preserved, not just to be looked at, but as an active part of culture. I think when artists can do those things, when they can figure out where they are, geolocate themselves within a community, listen to that community, and then create art that reflects that community, then everything else is going to come. It's just a matter of you staying with it in the times that it feels like, it's like growing dreads. That time when your hair's like this long, you're trying to get that little dread and it's just terrible looking. It's like, yeah, just stick through it. But if you stick through it, you're going to have the most beautiful locks you could ever imagine. It's the process.
Yeah. So there's so much to unpack there. And our producer is very stickler about the time. So some things that came to mind when you were talking, because I grew up in a very similar community, even though it was in a urban area. I grew up in a school, my elementary school. Our viewers will have heard me say was also it was a public school, but it was also like almost like a Panther school. It was like we just left there believing everything. I don't know anyone from that elementary school where my father was the principal, where we didn't believe that we could do anything. And so that seed carried us. And so when we moved across spaces, we would just go, why can't we do this thing? And it was interesting to see, because it feels like your community, like I said, is very similar. When I went to college, I would see people from other communities, and they were and I went to Mississippi University for Women, PWI. They were just beat down and scared, and I was like, "What is wrong?" Like I couldn't figure out what. It was years before I could quite figure out on the map, because you could see it on the map. Like I knew when somebody was from Yazoo, they weren't gonna be beat down. Utica, Jackson, it was a very similar space and way of moving through the world. Just a belief in oneself. So right now we're dealing with so-called critical race theory, and I will say this again: that is an academic discipline. It is not a historical. It's not history. Those are two different things. As a parent, what do you do right now? Because even the most well-intentioned school isn't going to get it all in, right? What are you doing right now to make sure your kids, well, you have one of them working with you. And for those of y'all who don't know, Carlton and Brandon did something crazy. They had children, they almost out the house, and then they went and had another. No, that's right. They're providing us three good human beings. But you've got one working with you, got, a teenager, but you got a little person. What are you doing to have to connect them with who they are and instill in them? Because, you know, I'm one of these people that understands that schools had to be desegregated, but I'm also one of these people that understands that hurt a lot of people, particularly people with fewer resources, because those children did not get what they had from the community to keep them going.
Yeah, so I think what you just ended with is my will be my final answer. But I'll start by saying I take all of the responsibility off of Tate Reeves for providing my family, my children, my community with a solid education. Mississippi has never designed an education system that was built for people of color, for Black people, and they never will. That's just not part of the design of the system of the state of Mississippi. I don't accept that. I just recognize the things that I can have an impact on and the things that I can't at this moment. And so for me, the end part of your statement was about the community. So it's about creating a community space. The thing that I had growing up was having a community that could reinforce the lessons that I was being taught in various spaces. It was having a teacher in my elementary school that had taught my aunts and uncles, that knew my grandmother by first name basis, and could both threaten and back up threats to engage your grandparents in a conversation about your well-being. So for me, it's not Carlton's responsibility to provide my children with the whole rounded, because that's a community's responsibility. They say it takes a village, but that's real. It takes a village to raise a child, and part of what everything in life is telling us to segregate from each other, to separate in ways in which we no longer find ourselves part of a community process. For me, the answer to your question is rebuilding community. It's about rebuilding the fabric of the community, the social fabric, the cultural fabric, the educational and intellectual fabric, the faith fabric, to where we can build again together in ways that allow us to live and grow on love and trust, and not be so afraid of our neighbors that we go for decades without even knowing who lives in the door next to us. And having our children feel like, oh, for so many people, it's like, my children don't fool with them. Ain't that your sister and her kids? Like, what are you talking about? You don't fool with them. This is family, this is community. So there's just so much work we have to do in that arena, but it caused us to get out of our shells and to engage in building something that is greater than ourselves. And for us, that's the work that we're trying to do here at the Mississippi Center for Cultural Production, is trying to reinvest in the development of community, the type of community network that can be resilient and also thrive, be resilient in times that are of struggle and thrive in times that are normal. And that's a way that we haven't seen our community in a long time. And it's a long journey. It's not going to happen in 5 years. We're 5 years in. It's going to take us another 15 just to see if the thing that we're talking about is actually viable. So that's the other part, the time that it takes to actually reverse the systemic issues that we're being dealt with. But critical race theory is a political issue. That's my grandma. That's my grandmother, F.C. Roberts. That is brother sitting next to her in the little light. That's my mother on the end in the black jacket, Geneva Roberts. And in her lap is my uncle, J.W. Roberts. So yeah, that's a picture. My mother's the only person still living from that picture.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's interesting because, I maintain that what we're seeing now is a design to pull Black and brown folks out of their communities, pull resources and separate resources, from everything from churches where we're 50% of the population, but we have no leadership positions at the church. Why are you at the church? I'm confused by that. Um, it's so interesting to watch this idea that something else is better than those that look like you, talk like you, walk like you, worship like you. Um, and it's something I continually talk about because I think what has happened, particularly with people my age and a little bit younger, is that space. Because I think Utica was very lucky that that grocery store or the things that happened very recently. I think there's too much space between other stuff because it's been this idea we don't even remember the reason that we lived in where we lived. It's that generation, that buffer, because that who wants to talk about trauma? I don't. I want to have a conversation about traumatic things. It's very difficult. And so, we don't talk about trauma. We don't talk about the reason we did this is because of this. And so our collective memory, we've lost that collective memory. And so we've decided that living and doing something with people that don't look like us is the better thing. Because when we stay in community, I think our bodies may feel a little bit like, I don't know that we realize it, that often feels that trauma, that can be trauma triggering. We don't even talk about it. We don't even talk about it. I just had a long conversation with a friend of mine today about kind of this idea that our stuff isn't good enough yet. And I'm going to keep saying this because one day people going to use clips and remember I said this, yet people make money off our artistic effort without, paying us isn't the right word, without compensation. And so my final, maybe my final question, we talk a lot about the living wage, about rewarding, not rewarding, but paying artists because that is labor. Talk about the model you all have created for compensating for the labor that is art.
Well, we don't ever ask artists to do anything for free. That's just not part of our lexicon. Artists have to be paid, and the way that artists work is very different. It's not very super different, but it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's not you clock in and punch out. It's a situation in which your creativity is an extension of yourself, and so we're constantly making, we're constantly imagining, we're constantly engaging in that creative process. It's not something you shut off and on. And so when you think about what an artist brings to the table in terms of their craft, what you're looking at is hours and in many cases years and decades of experience and work that is uncompensated to provide you with whatever moment that they give you in that moment, right? And so for us, we just try to work with artists to make sure that they're being compensated for the work that they do, never assuming that artists are giving their time, because artists have probably given more to society than any philanthropic institution, because what they bring is so valuable yet so undervalued. For us, the people that work here, we don't employ anybody that makes less than $15 an hour. That's the bare minimum. Currently, we have 14 people on staff that we're working with, and that is supported through Sipp Culture. We're working with Artists at Work, which is providing 2 artists that we're embedding in local cultural institutions. One of which is working with the Jackson Hines Comprehensive Health Center here in here in Utica, to provide a health desk over the course of the next year in a 3-year project, basically to develop ways in which our community can see health and wellness beyond medical interventions, and see arts and culture as a health and wellness intervention. And then we're working with the Utica Institute on the campus of Hines Community College Utica campus to continue to build out space for oral histories with our community. And we have an artist that is employed for the next year that will be working with that particular institute. So those are ways that we are employing artists. We have another artist that is our community impact artist, who's a young lady named Christina McPhail, who's out of Madison and has been working with us in the development of her new works. We believe in artists, and we believe in arts and culture as a real deal, bona fide part of community development. Without the artists, in many ways, as a community, we end up being lost. We can't find ourselves, because the artist holds the rituals and the songs and the dances and the dress, and that's not any one artist, but that is the role of the way that arts and culture functions in our communities. The role of the faith leader is an artistic and creative practice. That's not outside of arts and culture. It is deeply embedded. I have this whole piece I wrote about Martin Luther King and his role as an artist, his oratorical skills as a means of like wooing and changing the direction of the civil rights movement. It was art. It wasn't just a political practice. It was art. So we just have to value artists and treat them as integral parts of the community. Not just as the people you bring in to perform or to draw you something or to sing something.
Yeah, it's so interesting you said that. I was listening to some podcast or other, and they were talking about how, is it Dostoevsky is actually Ukrainian, even though he's Russian by presentation. They have created him as a Russian, but he wrote a lot of his symphonies are based on Ukrainian folk tunes. And so they're kind of highlighting that. And there was this person, and so a lot of symphonies around the world are really focusing on that, using a lot of Ukrainian art in solidarity and protest. And there was this one person, he was like, well, I just don't think the artist would want you to do that. I was like, have you met the artist? Do you know what an artist is? Which goes back, did I say that right? Because I always get Tolstoy and Dostoevsky confused, because there we go. But it's so interesting to talk about art as a part of protest, art as protest. And you have really, thank you so much. This is really, and I consider myself an enlightened human being, but you have really reframed some of my ways of thinking, and how I think about art and where art is present in our communities. And the answer is everywhere. And then when we get off, we're going to talk about how I can get some collard greens from the community, because I'm part of the community.
We got you.
Okay. All right. So you all know that we are a nonprofit. We're a 501c3, and we're the smack dab in the middle of our spring fundraising campaign, which is Solutions for Mississippi. We believe that transparency in government, in our leadership is super, very important. So please take a moment, and this is the part where I say, no donation is too small, but also no donation is too big.
That's right.
That's right. Every donation matters, and we appreciate each of you who have given when you could have given to someone else. So please consider supporting this campaign in any way that you are able. And this is what happens when you don't have your co-host. I did not tell the producer to put this graphic up. Next up, we have, who is our guest for next week? The title of her book is Nice White Ladies, Jessie Daniels. I am so excited to have her on, and hopefully Donna will be feeling better and we can talk about her book. She is an author and professor at Hunter College, and it's going to be a grand old time. Once again, Carlton, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to sit down with me. And thank you so much for helping us reframe art and artistry. And I look forward to actually seeing you in person very soon. MFP viewers, we hope to see
Thank
you
you.
next week. Thank you.